This is Los Angeles, Saturday, January 30th, 1954. Yes, this is Los Angeles, and this is Dave Showalter, Director of Public Affairs for KNX, with another transcribed program produced by the KNX Department of Public Affairs and presented in the public interest each Saturday at this same time. This afternoon we're going to talk about psychic phenomena, and we're very fortunate on this score because we have as our roundtable discussion group three outstanding individuals representing the fields of literature and philosophy, science and astronomy, news and investigation of psychic phenomena. Let me introduce to you first of all one of America's foremost authors and philosophers, Mr. Aldous Huxley. Mr. Huxley?
Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be here.
And Mr. Huxley's works include Brave New World, Point Counterpoint, The Art of Seeing, Chrome Yellow, Ape and Essence, and others. His most recent article in the January 11th issue of Life magazine opens up a new realm of thought, for in it Mr. Huxley tells of his experiments, both past and present, in the fields of extrasensory perception in particular and so-called psychic phenomena in general. Our second guest is Dr. Gustaf Stromberg, an astronomer of international renown, a member of the scientific research staff of Mount Wilson Observatory from 1917 to 1946. Dr. Stromberg, how are you,
sir? Well, I'm glad to be here this afternoon.
Well, we're glad to have you, sir.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Stromberg is a pioneer in another field, that of compiling scientific data pointing to the survival of memory and consciousness after bodily death. Many of his findings are contained in two books, The Soul of the Universe and The Searchers. The third guest on our discussion panel is Mr. James Crenshaw, Dean of Los Angeles Court Reporters and a member of the Herald Express staff, and a newsman of more than 30 years' experience. Jimmy?
Thank you, Dave. Very glad to be here.
Mr. Crenshaw is the author of Telephone Between Worlds, regarded as a standard book on psychic phenomena. My, these words are difficult for a man in this particular position with all of these learned men here. Well, that's a rather long introduction to what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting discussion here. Well, let's begin, gentlemen, if you will, by explaining, or rather defining, the terminology that I know a lot of people have seen in Life magazine recently, and that has to do with ESP, psi, and PK, I believe. Is that correct, Jimmy?
And precognition is another term that is used, and it's all classed under the general heading of parapsychology, or that which goes along with or beside psychology. It's something that a great many scientists...
Yes, and we ought, of course, I think at this point to make the sharp distinction between abnormal psychology and parapsychology. Abnormal psychology is what used in the good old days to be called madness or insanity, whereas parapsychology represents, to my mind, an enormous field of mental activity in which we all participate to some extent, at least potentially, and in which certain people participate much more than others, and which has nothing to do with abnormal psychology. On the contrary, it's been found that people in asylums have less psi abilities than sane people outside. This is a very important point to stress, that it has nothing to do with being cracked or nuts.
Well, Mr. Huxley, would you define psi for us? Let's perhaps leave it at psi.
Well, psi, the importance of this symbol, psi, is that it carries no emotional overtones. You can use the word psi in a without your blood pressure rising, as it would if you use phrases like telepathy, clairvoyance, etc. It's very important in any kind of scientific discussion to have words which have no emotional tinge to them, which don't arouse automatically prejudices. And psi is the general name given to all these unusual faculties. One of them, for example, is telepathy, the direct communication of a mind with another mind. The other is clairvoyance, where a mind is aware of events in the external world without making use of its sense organs. And precognition is when a mind becomes aware of an event which has not yet happened. And then finally we come to psychokinesis, which is, may be defined as the effect of a mind upon matter outside its own body and out of contact with its body, a direct influence of mind over matter. That, I think, sums up the general meaning of psi.
And psi was chosen as the Greek letter most applicable because it is, of course, associated with the sound of psychology and
Yes.
psychic research and
Yes.
things like that. Isn't that correct, Mr.
Yes,
Huxley?
that's it.
Well, now let's, for a moment here, if you don't mind, let's start with you, Dr. Stromberg, from whom we haven't heard except to say hello. And I wonder if you'd just state your particular interest in this problem. Could you, sir?
Well, of course, my interest ordinarily has been in astronomy and physics and related phenomena, that is natural science. But I was interested in philosophy as a young man, and in later years I have studying different aspects of psychical research, not making an experiments myself, but follow the general investigations which are going on. And I've come to the conclusion that in the human brain we have an organ which makes it possible for us to contact certain activities in the world soul, which is an old idea introduced by Plato, perhaps not originally. And the idea is that our brain is not a machine by which we think, it's an instrument by which we make contact with a cosmic ocean of consciousness. It's a receiving set which can be tuned or is tuned to certain activities in a universal mind.
Let me interrupt you at this point, Dr. Stromberg, if you will, please. Mr. Huxley, how do you feel about this particular statement that Dr. Stromberg has just made here, sir?
Well, I'm in substantial agreement with it. I feel very strongly that mind is not completely explicable in terms of physical phenomena as the currently fashionable hypothesis supposes. I'm quite convinced, as Jung, for example, if anybody chooses to read that very valuable book of Jung's, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, has made so very clear that we must regard mind as something independent, as a real substantial existence. And this conception, after all, has been held by a number of very eminent modern philosophers. I take William James, who expresses himself in phrases very like those which Dr. Stromberg has just used, where James was convinced that the brain does not produce thought. It is the instrument of thought. It is the valve, so to speak, through which what he calls a continuum of cosmic consciousness enters the individual life. And the French philosopher Bergson felt exactly the same thing. He regarded mind as being potentially omniscient, aware of everything everywhere, and the brain being, so to speak, the reducing valve which made this universal mind available for individuals on the surface of the planet, made it possible for us to survive as biological creatures on the planet. And this goes back, of course, to very ancient times, and we have the same idea in religion. After all, what is the phrase of St. Paul? God in whom we live and move and have our being. This is simply another expression of this basic conception, which I personally regard as true.
Let's get off onto the repertorial side here. Here's, in a sense, a lay person, I presume, aren't you, Jim?
Yes, certainly. I'm an observer. I'm essentially a reporter in all of these matters, perhaps an interpreter to a certain extent. But my interest in what we now call psi, or psychical research, is that of an observer. However, I'm certainly interested in the scientific aspects, and of course, entirely in agreement from my observations with what both Dr. Stromberg and Mr. Huxley have said. And it is very interesting to me that these rather what we call philosophical ideas, which are considered to be a little bit vague to some people, are being backed up now by not only scientific proof but scientific experiment. In Dr. Stromberg's case, for instance, he has done a remarkable job of correlating in his book, The Soul of the Universe, a large amount of data, make it data, which tends to support just what he has said. It tends to support explicitly immortality. In other words, he has brought together a great deal of laboratory evidence, adduced by other people, of course, but which he cites in his book, to show that there is an immaterial structure back of everything, an immaterial structure back of every cell, for instance, and that there is evidence of that, so that it shows that when the cell is gone, what we call dead, the immaterial structure must survive. And I wish Dr. Stromberg would tell us a little bit about some of the Yale University experiments and other data which show that that is so. I know that he's recited them at length in his book, but I'm sure it's interesting.
The idea behind this, what we might call immaterial structure, or as I prefer to call it, living fields, is that the structure and the functions of a cell or a nerve system or a brain are due not to the molecules themselves and their arrangement in space and in time, but to an electrical field with definite properties, structural as well as functional properties. This idea I advanced many years ago. I guess it wasn't new at all, but anyway, I worked on it. And then, some years later, at the medical school of the Yale University, they started to study experimentally the electrical field, if there were any, around certain organisms. For instance, they took a tadpole and with a very sensitive electrical instrument, they explored the electrical field in the surrounding waters, the water surrounding the living animal. The effect was most remarkable when the animal was undergoing metamorphosis. That's why they took a tadpole. They could take any other animal in which the activities was rather high. And they found that the structure of the future animal was already in existence before it had acquired a material substratum. So that the animal was, the form of the animal was given before the atom and the molecules have become incorporated in the electrical fine structure. The matter which was dissolved in the solution, so to say, clicked into place, and after that has been going on for a certain time, and a new kind of animal, that is an animal with a different shape than was existent before, had gradually come into place. That's how an animal grows, and we have all reason to believe that that is the way all living things acquire their complex structure.
In other words, Dr. Stromberg, the immaterial structure comes first.
Exactly.
And it also remains after the material structure is long since gone. Is that correct? Isn't that what
the first part is all right. The immaterial structure, the field structure, or as I have called it in some publications, the autonomous field, which is independent of matter, is the primary thing. Matter, in the form of molecules of particular structure, it is incorporated in this pre-existent immaterial field. And in that way it acquires its remarkable and unique structure.
Well, it's in a sense rather like the idea of Plato, which exists before the corporeal object.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a projection in advance of an idea.
The idea of archetypes, I believe he called
it. Archetypes is all right. You may call it entelechy.
Yes.
If that is the right pronunciation.
Oh, well, I hope it is. I don't know.
It is correct.
Well, let's just for a moment now see if we can get this down to something that gets in the area of brass tacks. Why should we be investigating a field like this, and how does this affect me as an individual? Mr. Huxley, would you care to answer that, sir?
Well, I would say it affects us all as individuals, inasmuch as it gives us a rather different conception of what is the nature of man. I mean, let us ask this question: what is man? This is a very difficult question indeed. In the past, of course, the answer was that man is a body, a soul or psyche, and a spirit. I mean, this is the basic Christian conception, the body, the psyche, and what St. Paul calls the pneuma, the spirit. And this is a conception which you will find in virtually all the great religious conceptions of the world. In modern times, on the contrary, there has been a tendency to divide man into only two stories, that is to say, a body and a psyche, and to derive the psyche from bodily activities, which therefore denies the freedom of the will, denies any degree of autonomy to the human mind, and really, it seems to me, makes complete nonsense of all our actual experience. And now what Dr. Stromberg has been talking about is this new scientific evidence which seems to support that man and life in general is not solely a product of material forces, of physical forces, that there are other forces at work. And as I understand him, that these autonomous fields which he has been talking about can be in direct contact with the mental aspect of the universe. Isn't that your conception, Dr. Stromberg?
Of course, originally an effort was made to understand how a complex structure, like a brain structure or a nerve system or a cell or any living structure, how it acquired its characteristics both in structure and in function. Take a special case which may interest ordinary men and all of us, of course, is how does the human brain acquire its remarkable structure with billions of neurons all connected into a unified system. There isn't a single loose end in the thing. Every neuron is connected with other neurons. There are no loose ends in the whole system, and that is maybe regarded as an indication of that the brain is a unified system. That's one thing. Another thing is that this autonomous field, which gives the brain, say, its particular structure, is also the foundation for mental activities, so that if I think, or if I make a logical deduction, or even if I remember something, all those mental activities are fundamentally due to activities in an immaterial electrical field, which can be investigated by ordinary physical methods.
Mr. Huxley, out of this whole thing, as far as you personally are concerned, if I can try to pin you down here, what have you come to believe? This is kind of a general question, but perhaps I haven't stated it properly, but would you attempt that?
Well, my own belief is that human beings are not completely isolated individuals. My belief, for example, is that the Freudian analysis of the human being as a conscious self with a subconscious consisting of repressed desires and conditioned reflexes and so on, and a body, is not a sufficient analysis. I'm inclined to think that C.J. Jung's analysis of the human mind is much nearer the truth. And incidentally, it was the conception of the subconscious which such earlier workers as Morton Prince and F.W.H. Myers held. Actually, I think that Freud's conception of the subconscious was a retrogression. It was a limitation of the older conception which was forming in the later years of the 19th century. And Jung has done an important work in pointing out that beyond the personal subconscious there lies what he calls the collective subconscious, and I would say that beyond that again there lies what in the language of religion is called the world of pure spirit, and that through the collective subconscious and through the world of pure spirit I would say that all individuals are connected with one another, and that it is this fact which makes possible such phenomena as telepathy and clairvoyance.
Dr. Stromberg, does human consciousness extend into, well, another world, if I can put it that way, sir, after death?
We can say that it always has a worldwide extension. It covers the whole universe. I and the universe are one, in a sense. I am part of the whole. There isn't a single event in the universe which is an isolated event. They're all connected, though, with causal chains. Not only physical events, but even mental events. So when a man has an idea, it's possible that there is an interference between his brain action and another man's action. And in that way, we might get a possibility of explaining clairvoyance, say, and telepathy by a kind of interference between the mental activities in different minds.
And that is something outside of physical structure.
It's something outside of physical structure. Physical structure is simply the observable electromagnetic field, which is a reflex of mental activities, but it by no means is identical with it.
And therefore, the end of physical structure does not mean the end of memory.
Certainly not.
That's right. Now, in my own observational experience, I have come to the conclusion that there very definitely is existence after death. There is existence in another world, and furthermore, that it's a very real world. Dr. Stromberg has spoken of his immaterial structures which can exist apart from the material. I go even further and say that those immaterial structures, in a sense, take on a nature of the physical in a different dimension. We can understand that in these days of television, radio, and so forth, where we deal in different frequencies. We turn our dial, we get a picture of a program from New York. We turn the dial again and we get a picture from somewhere else or a different program. And they're all apparently almost coexistent in the same atmosphere. Now, suppose we had a world that was actually made up of these different frequencies, and our own structures were made up of those frequencies. Perhaps if we were made up of frequencies of the nature of television waves, to use a very broad analogy, we wouldn't be able to see each other. You would be made up of the physical frequencies. I'd be made up of the television frequencies, to put it crudely. And we wouldn't see each other, but we'd certainly be, we'd both be coexisting, and we'd be perfectly real. That is what we are finding out in effect by observation and to put it bluntly, communication from this so-called other world. It's as the old philosophers said, and the Greeks said it, and the Egyptians said it, that which is above is like that which is below. And we have those structures there, and therefore our own personality and our own form, a replica of it, goes on in the so-called next worlds. And I think that physical aspect of the next world is one of the most difficult things for people to understand, because they, oh, that's crazy. They can't seem to grasp the idea that the next world is something more than just pure mind. From all of the communications from all over the world, down through history, it all indicates that there is a very real world with certain physical aspects. It is a world of progression, true, in which there is supposed to be a continual gravitation and progression toward this soul of the universe, which Dr. Stromberg has described. And whether it achieves a state where there is a formlessness eventually, that's another thing. We do know from these communications that the next world is very real and very substantial.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to turn for just a moment now to Mr. Huxley and ask you, sir, if you have anything. This, I suppose, could go on for some time.
Could go on forever.
And I ask you, before we leave this particular thing, if you have anything, Mr. Huxley, that you'd like to make a comment about. That's a rather broad introduction, but would you try that on for size before we leave you, sir?
Well, I think my comment on Mr. Crenshaw's remarks would be that maybe we can have a world which is completely substantial and yet mental. I wouldn't necessarily think that it has any kind of physical structure. I mean, the investigation, for example, of hallucinations, these things are, for the experiencer, very often more real than the world which we generally call real. I don't say that his conception of a succession of frequencies which may be ultimately physical in origin may not be correct. I mean, there is a great problem there. For example, in Hindu psychology, there is this conception of what may be called occult physics, that we are all surrounded by layers of what is ultimately material, although of a much subtler kind. Well, you can either interpret it in those terms, or it seems to me you can, just as satisfactorily, as far as I'm concerned, interpret it in terms of purely mental phenomena, which for the experiencer are just as real as physical ones.
But this is a mental world too, isn't that
This
right?
is a mental world, but
So
it
it's-
has some kind of a physical substratum, evidently. I mean, we're correlated with something which we must call physical. I leave this matter open. I mean, it seems to me a very difficult problem to decide.
Dr. Stromberg?
Well, there is one thing I want to call attention to, that is that in modern physics, matter has lost its substance. When we analyze matter and say, what is matter? We describe it, say, as a wave function, to use a technical term. It's a mathematical concept. It says something about the energy, the properties, how much energy can come out of it, how we can modify it and make it work, so to say. But when we come to the bottom, we don't know a thing about what matter really is. It may, if we speak about it is, that means that we have to refer to something else. And the only thing I can imagine, which is behind matter, which is more fundamental than matter, is mind. Mind is probably on the bottom of everything. That is an old idea, said Descartes. He said, cogito ergo sum, that means I think, therefore I am. For him, the process of thought, the process of consciousness, was the primary thing he was entirely certain about. Everything else was more or less of an hypothesis. But that I am a thinking being, that is the primary thing which nobody can really doubt.
Well, I think it was Sir Arthur Eddington, the great British physicist and astronomer, who said that matter has practically been reduced to a mental concept anyway, and to extend the idea of this matter being in layers of mental concepts is no more difficult than trying to decide what it is on this level, I believe.
Well, I see we've reached the end of our time, and may I at this time thank our distinguished guests on this afternoon's most interesting roundtable discussion on psychic phenomena, Mr. Aldous Huxley, Dr. Gustaf Stromberg, Mr. James Crenshaw. And this is Dave Showalter asking you to tune in again next Saturday at this same time, when we'll take you on a fascinating tour by a tape recorder of Children's Hospital.